Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
What you hear is not exactly your typical prisoner. This is actually a prisoner in an experiment. It was an experiment that went horribly wrong. Professor Zimbardo is the professor that is notoriously known for this experiment, dubbed the Stanford Prison Experiment. He had about 70 college students apply to be a part of the experiment. Of those 70, a little over 20 were brought in for the experiment. He conducted a physical and mental evaluation to make sure that they were healthy for the experiment. And then he went on to randomly select who would be a guard and who would be a prisoner. The prison itself was made up to appear as if it was an actual prison. There were cells, there was solitary confinement. There was also an acting parole board and a pastor that would come in. The guards were briefed prior to the prisoners coming in, letting them know that they were not allowed to physically abuse the prisoners, but they were allowed to use tactics to frustrate them. Those who were chosen as prisoners were arrested at their homes with nobody knowing what was going on. It was a mock arrest. The family didn't know, the neighbors didn't know, but it was a mock arrest and they were brought into the prison. The ultimate thought of the experiment going in was to determine the behavioral and psychological effects that a prison can have on the prisoners and prison guards. What was to be an experiment that would last 2 weeks ended up lasting 6 days, and many believe that it was so torturous for the people that it was 6 days too long. As the prisoners entered their cells and their life in the mock prison started, it took only 24 hours for the prisoners to start rebelling, for the guards to start implementing interesting and tactful punishments that were non-abusive in nature. But those tactics were mentally abusive all the same. The prisoners were given a number, and that was utilized as their name. Their daily life was as if they were in a prison setting. The guards would use tactics such as doing strip searches, forcing exercises, and only allowing for them to use buckets as bathrooms. Prisoners that wanted to leave were so broken down that they felt that if they left, they would be letting everybody down. Prisoner 819, as you heard in the beginning, he actually didn't want to do anything at all. And because he refused to do anything, the other prisoners were punished as a result. So prisoner 819 was put in the hole, and eventually the prisoners rebelled against him, which is what you heard in the beginning of this video. He was eventually released from the experiment and replaced by another prisoner. And that prisoner came in and did a hunger strike and another rebellion. Eventually he did leave the experiment, but rumor went around that he was going to be planning a prison escape for all the prisoners that were inside. The guards actually planned for that escape, and it never happened, so they got really frustrated and punished the prisoners as a result. Aside what went on between the guards and the prisoners, they would have visitation with the family. Anytime family visitation would come in, or they would write letters to their family, the guards would tell them what to write in the letters and would tell them how to act and present themselves during visitation, so that the family would think that everything was going great during the experiment. For the parole board, it's actually interesting. There was an ex-inmate who had been in jail for several years, and he was the runner of the parole board. He would actually deny inmates the ability to be released, and he found himself doing it for the same reasons that his parole would be denied, that would frustrate him, and he found was just ridiculous reasonings for his parole to be denied, but he was denying it to them. So it's very interesting to see in just 6 days, all of this was going on within that experiment. Just normal, everyday people, and people that had already been in these situations previously, how they completely did a 360 on how they normally would act and react in that short amount of time. It happened quick. It wasn't until a graduate student came to watch over the experiment with the professor that she said, you're torturing these people. And he realized and said, okay, you're right, I am torturing them. And he immediately ended the experiment. A big issue with the experiment is that he actually involved himself because he considered himself the superintendent of the jail. Maybe the experiment would have ended a lot sooner had he not involved himself within the experiment himself. So he was basically getting wrapped up within the emotions of being in the facility as well. Unfortunately, it was a terrible experiment, and people believe that he was a monster of a professor, and he went through a lot of issues throughout his career because of that experiment. But in my eyes, that experiment brought light to many things, and we could have really learned from it, and we have learned from it. There are programs now because of that experiment that have helped with prison reform. However, even though that reform is there, it hasn't necessarily stopped us from being party to situations throughout all of history. Shortly after this experiment, there was actually a very notorious prison riot in Attica Prison in New York, where 10 hostages and several inmates had ultimately been killed after negotiations had gone south in the riots. The uprising wasn't exactly planned, it just happened, but ultimately it was basically because of poor prison conditions for the inmates. They would only get toilet paper once a month. Food was subpar. There was rumors of it being overcrowded, even though it was then said that there was no overcrowding. Now, the same day that the riot broke out, the state did actually gain control of most of the prison. However, in Yard D was where the hostages were being held, and there was about 1,200-ish prisoners that were out there holding them hostage. And they worked for about 3 days to try and negotiate on getting better circumstances within the jail. Now, the state police, they weren't having that, so they wound up going in guns a-blazing and wiped out about upwards to 40 people, injuring a lot more, and 10 of the hostages wound up being killed. Initially, it was said that the inmates killed the hostages via a knife to their neck area. An autopsy report, and it was later determined that the hostages were actually shot by the police themselves, and they blamed it on the inmates. From there, it took about 18 years of a trial for them to finally be put in the wrong for what they did during the riots in terms of what they did to the hostages and lying in regard to the inmates doing it. It took about another 5 years for them to negotiate how they would be compensated for the troubles that they have been through in their lives, including the families. Hostages that perished and the hostages that were injured were not allowed to sue the state, as the death benefits and their paychecks were deemed as payment for the atrocities that occurred that day. Another notable case is from the reservists that were stationed in Iraq in 2003. They were guarding a prison in Abu Ghraib. It's about 20 miles outside of Baghdad. It was their first time ever being a prison guard, and basically people that were being run through there were coming from other units that were picking up individuals during their security checks. They would put them in the prison. They were broken down into 3 different categories: a common criminal, a security risk to basically your everyday soldier that was over there in the war, and then your high level risk individuals. Now, this prison was originally ran, obviously, by Saddam Hussein. There was originally 60,000 people in that prison, and they would be tortured by the regime. When the prison fell, after Saddam fell, it was cleaned out. It was cleaned up. They tiled the place. They put in bathrooms and everything like that. The prison had just been taken over by a new commander and had just been opened up to the U.S. servicemen and women to utilize it as a prison for the U.S. It took from June of 2003, from its opening day, to October of 2003 for there to be sadistic, blatant, and written criminal abuse at that prison. There was abuse that I can't even speak of on this video because it is just too horrid to say. So if you're interested in learning more about it, you're going to have to follow the links that I provide at the end of this video. Since it was found of the abuse there and there was absolute evidence, people have been charged, they have been jailed for it. Since then, the prison was shut down and has been reopened. It's now renamed the Baghdad Central Prison and is ran by the Iraqi people. Now, it's just not prison life that can find you in a situation like that. You can be found in situations like this among natural disasters, such as, more notably, the recent earthquakes in Turkey. It was found that the government would come in and beat and torture anybody that was found looting or committing any type of theft when it was really just a hard time. You can see the pictures here. There was nothing for them because it was a massive earthquake that destroyed a lot of the area, and the aftershocks were just as powerful as the initial earthquake. You can also find yourself in this situation, as explained here, at sobriety houses. It can be found in school settings. It can be found in juvenile detention centers. It can be found in your very own home. I'm going to take a moment to bring you back to one of the gentlemen that was at the prison in Abu Ghraib. 18 years later, an interview was conducted, and the interviewee said that as he's speaking to him in regard to what happened at the prison, he's looking out in the distance, and it looks in his face as if he's wondering who the person was, that it wasn't actually him that was there that night. In conclusion, the experiment basically shows that people can act in a way that they have never seen before. It really can bring out the evil that lies deep within oneself to ultimately bring out the opportunity for control. It also shows how easily you can be peer pressured in group settings, especially when you have a difference in opinion and you're the only one that has the alternate opinion.
I know what you can turn into. I know what you're willing to do. If you say, oh, well, I'm not going to hurt anybody. Oh, well, it's a limited situation. It's over in 2 weeks.
Well, you in position, what would you have done?
I don't know. I can't tell you that I know what I'd do.
Would you believe?
I don't believe I would have been as inventive as you.
You mean,
I don't believe I would have applied as much imagination to what I was doing. Do you understand?
Yes, I understand.
I think I would have been a guard. I don't think it would have been such a masterpiece.
I didn't see where it was really harmful. It was degrading, and that was part of my particular little experiment to see how I could...
Your particular little experiment.
Yes,
Why don't you tell me about that?
I was running little experiments of my own.
Tell me about your little experiments.
Okay.
I'm curious.
I wanted to see just what kind of verbal abuse that people can take before they start objecting, before they start flashing back.
Yeah.
Under the circumstances, and it surprised me that no one said anything to stop me. No one. I started to get abuse people so much. I started to get so profane that, and still people didn't say anything.
I really could have gone on with a lot of different examples that go ahead and line up with this type of experiment. But what I want is to hear from you. What type of situations do you find yourself in, or have we as a people found ourselves in past history that would remind you of this type of experiment?